She hadn't come back for him. She'd come to close a ledger. 9 months of silence, and the only reason Briar Cullen was standing outside Kane Capital Investments at 8:45 on a Tuesday morning in February was because her father's debt was the last thing tethering her to a life she'd spent every day of those 9 months trying to quietly outlast. The building was on King Street West, which Briar thought was almost funny in a way that made her want to sit down on the frozen curb and have a very long cry. Glass and steel, 42 floors, one of those towers that looked like money had been poured directly into a mold and left to set. She'd temped here once, for 3 weeks in April, filling in for a bookkeeper at Castellan Legal on the 14th floor. That was when she'd met Kane. That was when a lot of things had happened. The revolving door exhaled warm air as she pushed through it. She'd had to angle herself sideways to fit through the gap, which hadn't been a problem in April. The lobby smelled of polished concrete and expensive coffee. The security desk was ahead, and the young man behind it looked up from his monitor, saw her face, then dropped his gaze approximately 6 inches lower, and very carefully kept it there. "Good morning," Briar said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She'd been practicing in the elevator on the way here, the one in her building that smelled like takeout containers and took 4 minutes to climb 6 floors. "I have a 9 o'clock with Kane Capital. I'm Briar Cullen. I'm here to deliver a settlement package." The security guard had the look of a man who was trying extremely hard not to say anything he'd regret. He picked up his phone. She knew what she looked like. She didn't need his careful silence to tell her. She was 37 weeks pregnant. The wool coat she'd bought at a Value Village in Scarborough 2 months ago had a broken top button she'd never got around to replacing, which meant it hung open over her stomach, which was approximately the size and weight of a bowling ball she couldn't set down. Her boots had a crack in the left sole that she'd patched with electrical tape, and she hadn't slept past 4 in the morning in 3 weeks, because the baby had decided her bladder was a comfortable place to rest its feet. She had also, somewhere between 6 this morning and now, stopped caring what she looked like to anyone in this building. She just needed the signature. Then she could go home. Then she could stop answering her door at midnight to men in overcoats who spoke in short sentences and stood too close. The security guard set his phone down. Something had shifted in his expression. "Mr. Radu will escort you up," he said. Briar adjusted the strap of the worn canvas tote bag over her shoulder. The folder inside was thick. 3 months of work, reconstructed from her father's handwritten ledgers, from bank records she'd had to request through a lawyer she could barely afford, from receipts her father had kept in a coffee tin on top of the fridge in the kind of obsessive way a man keeps evidence of the things he's most afraid of forgetting. $180,000, paid back in tranches over 11 years, routed through 4 different accounts because her father had been terrified of what would happen if he paid the whole thing at once, and they found a reason to say he hadn't. Her father had been right to be terrified. It had taken Briar 3 months to find every thread, and she was good at this. Numbers were the one language she'd always been able to trust. A door to the left of the security desk opened. The man who came through it was broad in the shoulders, somewhere past 50, with a quality of stillness that reminded Briar of the way a closed door looks right before someone on the other side of it decides to open it. He looked at her once, and whatever he saw rearranged itself somewhere behind his eyes very quickly. "Mrs. Cullen," he said, "I'm Pavel. I'll take you up." The elevator was glass on one side, looking out over the atrium. Pavel stood at her left, holding the door panel, and said nothing for 17 floors. Briar watched the atrium drop away beneath them, and breathed through her nose, and thought about the folder in her bag, and not about the floor they were heading to, or the office at the end of the hall on that floor, or the man she hadn't seen since a night in April, that she had spent the better part of 9 months pretending hadn't changed everything. The doors opened on 26. The office suite was quiet, cream walls, low lighting, a receptionist who looked at Briar and then at Pavel and didn't say a word. Pavel led her down a carpeted hallway past closed doors, past a wall of abstract art that probably cost more than Briar had earned in the past 3 years combined, and stopped in front of a set of double doors at the end. "He knows you're here," Pavel said, and pushed the left door open. She walked in. Nikolai Kane was standing at the window. He had his back to the door. He was in a dark suit, no jacket, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow in that particular way that made him look less like a man who ran a private equity firm, and more like a man who'd come to that particular meeting directly from doing something she didn't want to think about. His hair was shorter than she remembered. There was a new scar she could see from here on the back of his right hand, running from his knuckle to his wrist, still pink enough to be recent. He was looking at the city. He said, "I don't recall authorizing a settlement meeting." His voice was the same. She'd been half hoping it wouldn't be, that 9 months would have changed something about it. It hadn't. Low and precise, the kind of voice that expected to be answered correctly the first time. "The contract your organization signed with my father in 2013 includes an in-person settlement acknowledgement clause," Briar said. She was grateful her voice held. Paragraph 9, subsection C, wet signature required for debt dissolution. My lawyer confirmed it. I'm here to exercise that clause. Kane turned around. She watched him see her. He went very still in the way that she'd noticed, once, meant he was thinking faster than he was showing. His eyes moved down once, sharp and immediate and involuntary, and then back up to her face, and, for exactly 3 seconds, Nikolai Kane, who her father had once described as the most controlled man he'd ever owed money to, looked like someone had reached into his chest and taken something out without warning. "Cullen," he said. "The folder is self-explanatory." She pulled it from her bag and held it out. "My father made 11 years of payments. They were routed through accounts your organization appears to have misattributed in your internal ledgers. I've reconstructed the full payment history with bank documentation. The debt is cleared. I need your signature on page 47, acknowledging receipt and dissolution." Kane didn't take the folder. He crossed the room in 5 steps, which was 4 more steps than she'd been prepared for, and stopped 2 feet away from her. That close, she could see the particular way his jaw was set, the slight tension around his eyes that meant, she realized with some distant alarm, that she still knew how to read him. His gaze dropped again to her stomach, and this time it stayed. "How long?" he said, and it wasn't quite a question. 37 weeks. Briar kept her voice level. "The folder, Kane, page 47. Look at me." "I am looking at you, page." "Is it mine?" The silence in the room had a particular quality. The way silence gets when the question in it is the kind that changes the shape of whatever comes next. Briar had prepared for this. She had rehearsed the answer on the bus. She had been pragmatic about it, because pragmatism was the tool she'd been using since April to survive, and it had worked well enough to get her here. She said, "Do the math." She watched him do it, watched the number land, watched something shift in his face that she didn't have a word for, something that wasn't quite the cold calculation she'd expected, and wasn't quite anything else she could name. He reached out and took the folder from her hand. He opened it to the front page, spent approximately 4 seconds looking at her reconstruction, which had taken her 6 weeks to compile, and set it down on the desk behind him without reading further. "The debt is cleared," he said. "I need the signature on." "The debt is cleared, Cullen. I'll have Keating draw up the dissolution papers today. You'll have them by 5. He looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" And there it was. The question she'd also prepared for, the one that had felt much more manageable in her apartment at 4 in the morning with the baby pressing against her spine. "Because I didn't know what you were until after," she said. It came out flat and honest and slightly tired in a way she hadn't intended. "I thought you were an investor. My father told me who you actually were 6 weeks later, right before his first hospitalization." She paused. "I'd already done the test by then." Kane was quiet. The kind of quiet, she remembered, the kind that meant he was measuring something. "You hid from me," he said. "I made a decision to protect my child." "From me." "From whoever you'd made enemies of," she said, and her voice came out steadier than it had any right to. "I know how these things work. My father spent 11 years being afraid of what would happen if the wrong person found out he owed you money. I spent 9 months calculating what would happen if the wrong person found out I was carrying your—" She stopped. Drew a breath. "I moved. I changed my number. I had the baby's paperwork filed under Cullen. I stayed quiet, and I worked and I kept my head down. And then my father died and left me his debt, and I had no choice but to come here." She stopped herself. She was talking more than she'd planned to, which was what happened when she was exhausted and scared. And standing 2 feet away from someone she'd been carefully not thinking about for 9 months. Which meant she'd been thinking about him constantly, in the specific way where you're aware of every detail you're refusing to dwell on. "You thought I would hurt you," Kane said. "I thought someone else might." Something moved across his face, fast, and then it was gone. He took 1 step closer and she made herself hold her ground, which required a specific kind of effort she didn't have a name for. "Who sent the notices?" he said. "My people. Who came to your door?" "2 men. I don't know their names. They were polite." She paused. "The first time." His jaw tightened. The muscle beneath his ear ticked once. "That stops today." "I know. That's why I'm here." She reached past him for the folder, which required her to be briefly approximately 12 inches from his chest, which she managed without her hands shaking, which felt like a personal achievement. "Page 47, Kane, then I'll go. You're 37 weeks pregnant." He said it the way someone states a figure they're recalculating, not accusingly, just precisely. "In February. You took transit here." "I took the 504 and transferred at Union." A pause. "Cullen. It's a streetcar, not a war zone." He picked up a pen from the desk. He didn't sign anything. He was looking at her face with the particular attention he'd given her once before, in a different context, and she was acutely aware that remembering the context was not useful. "When is the due date?" he said. 3 weeks. And if it comes before 3 weeks, then I'll handle it. Alone." That was the plan, yes. She kept her voice light because the alternative was that it would stop being steady, and she had made it this far. Plenty of people manage. Kane set the pen down without signing anything. He looked at her for a moment, and she would have called the expression unreadable on any other person. But she had apparently spent enough time in proximity to him that she could read it. He was working out what he was going to do. "You came here for a signature," he said. "Yes." "You walked into this building, 9 months carrying my child, in February for a signature." There was something in his voice she couldn't categorize. Not anger, not quite. The clause required. "I know what the clause required." He picked up his phone from the desk and said, without dialing, "Pavel." And then, a moment later, "Get Morse up here." He looked back at her. "Sit down." "I don't need." "You've been on your feet for at least 2 hours in the cold, and you're 37 weeks, and you look like you haven't slept." He pulled the chair away from the desk and held it out. "Sit down, Cullen. The signature isn't going anywhere." She sat down, partly because her lower back had been making a quiet, sustained argument for the last 40 minutes, and partly because she was too tired to refuse things that weren't dangerous. He sat on the edge of the desk and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was somehow not as uncomfortable as it should have been. "Boy or girl?" he said. "I don't know. I asked them not to tell me." He was quiet then. "Why?" She looked at the folder in her lap. "I didn't want to get too attached to a specific picture, in case." She stopped. Started again. "I had a few difficult months. I thought it would be easier not to know." Kane looked at her with an expression she recognized this time, because she'd seen something like it once, in the morning, when she'd thought he was still asleep. Pavel opened the door. Behind him was a man in his late 40s with the kind of calm, careful manner of someone who'd learned to keep his face professionally neutral regardless of context. He took one look at Briar, glanced at Kane, and set his bag down on the conference table without being asked. "Miss Cullen," he said, "I'm Morse. How are you feeling?" "Fine," Briar said. "She came across the city on transit," Kane said, with a flatness in his voice that was not directed at her. "Blood pressure. Everything." "I'm not a patient," Briar said. "Not yet," Kane said. She wanted to argue that. She was aware it would take energy she didn't have to spare. She let Morse take her blood pressure, which was slightly low, and her pulse, which was elevated, and answer 3 questions she responded to accurately, and she looked at the grey February skyline and tried not to think about the fact that it was past 10 and she hadn't eaten since 5. Which was when Pavel came back through the door without knocking, and his face had the particular quality of contained urgency that meant he'd made a calculation about how much to say in front of her and decided the calculation didn't apply. "We have a problem," Pavel said. Kane was off the desk in a single motion. "Talk." Someone ran her cab. Pavel's eyes moved to Briar for a fraction of a second and then back to Kane. "The vehicle she took from the streetcar stop. Our traffic system flagged it 10 minutes ago. The inquiry came from a Harwick crew burner." The quality of the silence that followed was specific in a way Briar recognized, because she'd grown up adjacent to these silences, the kind that happened right before something changed, and not for the better. She stood up. "The Harwick organization," she said, because she had spent 9 months reading everything she could find about Kane's world, in the same way you learn everything about a thing you're hiding from, have been positioning in the financial district for 8 months. They've been looking for leverage. She looked at Kane. "I'm leverage." Kane looked at her. "They ran the cab," she said. "They know I was here, which means they know who I am or who I might be." She paused. "Anyone with access to your receivables ledger and a phone camera can do that math, and I'd imagine a Harwick crew has access to considerably more than that." Kane was looking at her with that particular expression again, the one that meant he was revising something. "You should have come to me 9 months ago," he said. "Quiet, not accusing, just the arithmetic of it." 9 months ago, I had no reason to believe you'd have received that information the way I needed you to," Briar said, which was the most honest sentence she'd said in this room, and the most difficult. He held her gaze for a moment, then he turned to Pavel. "Tighten the perimeter. 2 cars in the underground. Get Keating on the phone in 10 minutes. He looked back at Briar. "You're not going back across the city on the 504. Kane. "Not today." He wasn't asking. He was doing the calculation the same way she did with columns of figures, and the answer had come out a specific way. "Not while they know you were here. Not while they don't know what you are to me. Not while you're 37 weeks. She looked at him. She was too tired to pretend she didn't understand what he was saying, too tired to argue with the logic of it, which was sound, which she resented, because the logic being sound didn't change the fact that she'd spent 9 months building a very specific distance from this room and everything in it. "I'm not a kept thing," she said. "I know." He said it without hesitation, and something about the absence of argument in it made her stop. "You're a woman who reconstructed 11 years of payments from a coffee tin of receipts to settle a dead man's debt while 37 weeks pregnant, in February alone." He said it the same way he said figures. "Precisely, without decoration. I know exactly what you are." She didn't say anything to that. He picked up the folder from the desk. He flipped to page 47. He signed it, clean and clear, in the place she'd marked with a tab, and handed it back to her. "The debt is settled," he said, "officially on record, as of today." She took the folder, looked at his signature, the thing she'd come for, finally in hand, and it felt much smaller than she'd expected, which was probably the exhaustion. "Thank you," she said, because her mother had raised her to say it when it applied. "Eat something." He looked at her steadily. "Morse will bring food up. I need 20 minutes on the phone with Keating. Then we talk about what comes next." "I haven't agreed to there being a next." I know. He looked at her, and for a moment the calculation in his expression was absent, and what was underneath it was something she didn't have a word for, something she suspected he didn't either. Eat something anyway. She sat back down, because her back ached, because she was hungry, because the logic of the situation had cornered her the same way a good audit always did, all the figures aligning into a conclusion she hadn't wanted but couldn't argue with. She heard his voice in the hallway, low and precise, already 3 steps ahead. Morse came back with a plate she ate without tasting, and a glass of water she drank in one long pull, and he didn't say a word, because he was a man who'd clearly learned when words weren't the right tool. She sat with her folder in her lap and watched the grey city and thought about columns of figures, about the way a balanced ledger felt, about the clean simplicity of things that added up correctly. Nothing about the last 9 months had added up correctly. Maybe, she thought, she'd been calculating from the wrong starting point. Kane came back in at 10:20. He sat on the edge of the desk again, which she was starting to understand was where he went to think, and looked at her. "The Harwick situation will be handled," he said. "Handled," she repeated. "Cleepause, my word." She looked at him. "Your word is a thing you're offering me. It's the only thing I have right now that you haven't already verified against your own documentation." Which was, she thought, a precise and slightly disarming thing to say. "I'm not going to stop making my own decisions," she said. "I know. If I stay in this building tonight, I stay as someone who is here because the math worked out that way. Not because you've decided something about me." "Understood. And I want a copy of Keating's dissolution papers by 5, as you said. You'll have them by 3. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back with an expression that was careful in the way of a man who has learned that careful is the only approach that doesn't cost him more than he's willing to spend. "Room temperature water," she said finally. "I can't drink it cold. It makes me feel sick." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and considerably more dangerous to acknowledge. "I'll tell Morse." She looked back at the window. The city was still grey, still February, still exactly the city she'd been navigating alone for 9 months. It wasn't going to be different tomorrow. The arithmetic of her situation hadn't changed. It had just acquired more variables. The baby shifted, slow and heavy, pressing against her ribs. She put her hand over her stomach, just for a moment. "I know," she said quietly, to the small turning weight of her. "I know, me too." The folder was in her hand. The signature was on page 47. Nobody was going to knock on her door at midnight. That was enough to work with, for now.